Hi, Woody. Nice to see you. Thank you for taking part in this interview. I thought we could start by, me asking you to introduce yourself.
Well, I'm James, aka Woody Watson, and that's my handle. People have always called me Woody. Only family members refer to me as James. So everyone, including my Cantonese village friends, always refer to me as Woody. So that's what I prefer because I don't know how to respond otherwise. Uh, so that's my name, and my identity is that I'm a native um, prairie American, countryside. Grew up in a very small town in the state of Iowa, which is smack in the middle, of course, of the United States. And from there, I basically went off to the University of Iowa, where I began my study of Chinese. And there's a bit of a story there that coming out of high school from a little town in Iowa, I trying to think if I'd ever actually clapped eyes on an East Asian person before I was in Iowa City as an undergraduate. And I think I may have seen perhaps somebody in the capital city of Des Moines, but I don't know for sure. But I had absolutely no interest or no inclination at all to do Chinese studies or anthropology. But I did have one problem, and that is I had no money. Basically, I had enough that I'd earned as a high school student, working in a grocery store and various things like that, to pay for 1 year of college at the University of Iowa. And my parents really, or my father's a school teacher, really didn't have enough money to put me through himself, so I had to pay for myself. I knew that from about age 5. I knew I was on my own in that respect. So I had to find money. And I was in the student union one day and I saw an advertisement that said National Security Agency uh, scholarships in critical languages for, get this, native Iowans. And that did not mean American Indians who of course, had been in Iowa since the beginning of time. No, it meant people like me who was born in Iowa. So I actually looked at this carefully, and it said scholarships for study of Russian, Serbo-Croatian, and Chinese. Now, guess what that meant? National Security Agency. It meant enemy studies in those days. This was 1962, the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which it was very clear that Russia and the United States were almost on the threshold of nuclear war. So I figured that every kid in Iowa who had any sense would apply for a scholarship in Russian studies for the obvious reasons that there were jobs. You know, you could get into the National Security Agency or the American government, and you could use Russian. So I was right. There was a huge turnout for people wanting to do Russian. And I thought Serbo-Croatian, I don't really know about that, or I didn't even know much about it. And Chinese sounded intriguing. And I thought, now nobody in their right mind is going to apply for Chinese. And I was right. There were 3 of us in the entire state of Iowa who applied for the scholarship on Chinese studies. And we got full ride scholarships for the full, in my case, 3 remaining years of undergraduate studies. Everything they covered. And furthermore, there were 3 of us, and there were 5 teachers because they flew in 5 people from Taiwan who came across the prairie and ended up in this town of Iowa City in Iowa, teaching 3 of us. And basically what they did is adopt us. And we were in their homes. We had classes, and they just basically not just friends, we became family members. And we got a very good introduction to Mandarin Chinese. So I had a reasonable control of Mandarin as an undergraduate. And that's how it started. I remember going back and telling my father, who was, a tough old Iowa guy, that I'm just going to study Chinese. And he said, "You what?" what in the world, Chinese? And it was like I would just said I was going to become a Martian or something. And I said, no, 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 wait. They're jobs. I'm going to get employed. They're government jobs, and they're going to pay my way. And he said, okay, I understand. That's right. So that's how it started.
I mean, that ratio of student
Worked at
to,
and I remember at Harvard, when I started teaching at Harvard, students were always interested in how do you get started? You know, did your parents collect Ming vases, or you know, or did you go there when you were a little kid and go to the, you know? And I had to explain, no, I basically went there because I needed a job.
it was an opportunity, a
Yeah,
hard one to pass up, really. I mean, it's a quite a secure, stable
yeah, yeah,
scholarship, right?
yes. And then from there, I applied to graduate schools, and I had a choice of a few places, and I ended up going to Berkeley because I thought that sounded more interesting and less elite, in the sense of, you know, having a kid from Iowa, it would have been hard to go to the East Coast in this country, probably in East Coast schools. So
Oh,
I ended up
really?
at Berkeley, and it was you know, a people's university, and that was right smack in the middle of the psychedelic revolution and the anti-war movement, and
Amazing.
everything kind of took off from there.
So there
So
was
that
no expectation from the NSA that you would somehow join them straight after graduating your undergraduate,
I got
or
I got a job offer from the U.S. government at, uh, as a senior at the University of Iowa, but the graduate last year. They made a job offer to me, and I remember Ruby and I had just at that point decided to get married, and we were just kids, and we thought, gosh, and I remember it. They were offering me something like $14,000 a year, which was like, are you kidding? You know, that's a humongous amount of money, we thought. But then we decided that, well, we can always do that later. Let's think about graduate school. And Ruby needed to finish her BA. So we both went off to Berkeley. She did her BA at Berkeley, and I did my PhD there. And that's how that happened. We were very lucky to end up at Berkeley. It was just a completely, as they used to say in those days, an out of sight experience. It was just amazing to be in Berkeley in those days.
I can't
That may have been
imagine.
about the first time we had Chinese food too. We went over to San Francisco and went
Oh, I
into a
see.
Chinatown restaurant and tried it. Yeah, I mean, we had actually I had Chinese food in the homes of my teachers in
Mm.
Iowa City, but this is the first time we'd ever been to, I think, a proper Chinese restaurant, and it was really quite an experience.
Oh, fantastic.
So
Wow.
that's a bit of an autobiography, and it's some
Oh,
of it.
it was wonderful, very
My,
evocative.
my students always somehow thought that I had everything all worked out logically, and that, you know, it was just like a ping pong ball being bounced around the planet in those days. But one thing I will say, there were opportunities in the 60s for young people who were willing to work hard
Mm.
and not sleep, but basically work.
Mm.
Uh, so what worries me about my current generation of former students and others and the current generation is how hard things are and
Mm.
how circumstances have changed.
Mm. It's very
I don't think I
competitive.
would have had a prayer in hell had I grown up in an Iowa town today as a high school student. No way in hell
Wow.
would someone like me ever probably ever gotten out of there nowadays. The way
Mm.
the world has changed. And I really, really find that upsetting.
So the opportunities have narrowed some, you'd say, clearly you're saying
Completely collapsed in some respects.
collapse. So did you turn to anthropology within your China studies undergraduate studies, or were you, did you start to, okay, so,
I did Chinese studies, and I needed what Americans refer to as a minor, a major
mhm.
in Chinese and a minor. And actually, it was David Plath, Plath, David Plath, a specialist anthropologist who worked on Japan, who was at that time, I remember distinctly, a, a, a struggling assistant professor who had one suit and one tie that he wore for like 5 years. That's a bit embarrassing. I know David now quite well. and I knew him well, and I'm sure he would. He probably has more ties now, but but he was teaching a course on Japan, and I started taking his course, and it just clicked. And there were no China courses or anything in anthropology, but I took a lot of anthropology courses. It might have been better that there weren't any China specialists, because I basically had to learn other societies and other issues and other problems.
Mm.
And I think that's good. I didn't really get into Chinese studies beyond language until I was in Berkeley and found myself with historians and the anthropologist Jack Potter, who I worked with in the anthropology department at uh, at Berkeley, plus of course lots of others, historians. A big influence was Eberhard, Wolfram Eberhard, who worked in China as an historian and sociologist in the 1930s.
Wow.
And of course, to him, China was just a place that you run around and do whatever you want. But by the time I was studying Chinese studies, it was the depths of the communist communist revolution, and Americans weren't really allowed into China. Very few were.
Mm.
So it was quite a different time.
Yeah, definitely a generational change, really, because of that political change. Did so at that point, your thesis, your PhD research was focused obviously not on food. I'm guessing it was mainly about.
Never was on food. Food is, as I'll try to stress later, it was always derivative.
Okay.
I mean, it's obvious. I mean, how can you study something so blindingly obvious? In other words, is what I ended up thinking. I did study food, but it was just in the context of social organization. I was not a food specialist directly, even though I worked a lot on food. And I'll talk later about how I encountered some interesting banquet behavior that took me into the field. But it was quite clear that things were very different in those days. Actually, I could jump a little ahead. When I first decided to introduce a course on food, I call it Food and Anthropology. Mm-hmm. And I introduced it at the University of Pittsburgh, where I taught for about 5 years before going to Harvard, right immediately after teaching at SOAS. But I proposed that I wanted to teach a course on food and anthropology. And my colleagues said, "What? But that's not what we do. It's not a proper form of anthropology." It was considered trite, trivial, and silly. And I had to try to explain that's not the way I'm going to teach it. To me, it's a way of understanding social organization. I'm not interested in food per se, even though of course I like it, especially Chinese food. But it's a way of understanding how the social system works. And so I began by studying a course that dealt with Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and then new forms of organic movement and food studies. And then I included Chinese ancestor worship in there. Mm-hmm. The paper I'm working on for this conference, it derives from that research that I did. So it was a course on understanding social systems through understanding food. And where better to start with other than with the Old Testament, with Judaism, with Christianity, and of course Islam. And you go from there to India with all the Kacha, and Paka Kacha divisions and all kinds of issues, and of course the caste system and food restrictions. If you want to understand India, look at food, and that's how I taught the course. So it's never been about food. It's always been about social organization via food.
Using it as a lens.
The way I've always looked. So I've always been a little cautious about being only interested in food. Food for what? For what purpose? I mean, to me, that's something that you watch on television for the cook shows, but to do it, how to do it, it's what's behind it that's critical. What I always was interested in and have been. So I'm jumping around a bit, boomeranging.
No, it's great. I wondered then, it sort of brings to mind this question of whether or not that experience of putting that food course together, food and anthropology, was that the time when you revisited your earlier research to then emerge food themes from your work in Hong Kong in the new territories, or did that just, was that always something bubbling away as you were field working?
It was probably always bubbling away, but for the first 20 plus years, I basically did social organization. I spent a lot of time on issues like servitude and slavery, on a death ritual, various other kinds of work having to do with ancestor worship and such. Had interesting discussions with my Harvard graduate students. I began to get students from China. Trying to think of the date. It was probably about the time China opened up, and I had one or two students. One was Yan Yunshang, who now teaches at UCLA, who's become one of the world leaders in the field of Chinese studies. And he was a strapping lad from Heilongjiang up in North China, who ended up at Harvard, and he went back and did his research back in Heilongjiang, right back in the area where he did his where he was lived before. And so, but my Chinese students always told me that they could never do the things I did, never do the kind of research or writing or teaching like I did, because I taught about death ritual, about death pollution, burial practices, of course, which was in the villages that Ruby and I lived in, where that was what social life revolved around ancestor worship and death and burial and funerals, because it was an immigrant community filled with old people, and all young people were gone. And what was the big activity in town was in the village was death. And so naturally, as an outsider, I was fixated on death, to the point where my Cantonese village friends, the old men, said, you should stop going to so many funerals. You better be careful, pull back a little, because you're getting polluted. Yeah. I mean, as someone who knows India, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
You stay away. So, but of course, I was interested in, I've written a lot about death ritual, about such issues. And my current study for this food conference that you and your colleagues are running is really a way of looking at death through pigs and ancestors, because what are ancestors but dead people, connecting with them. And how do you do it? Through the medium of pork, pigs that you offer to the ancestors and then transpose them in different ways. So I studied all that and had written about it. But my Chinese students would always say to me, God, I could never do that. Oh, I could never possibly do it. Even to this day, my Chinese students are a little worried about all the stuff that I've written about these issues. So my view is that food and all these kinds of topics are means of understanding the guts of a society.
Guts, that's very well put.
People who work in India know very well what I mean by that. The food is not really about food, it's about social organization.
No, it's a very important symbol as well. Yeah, absolutely. So then I guess did you and Ruby both go to Hong Kong from the very beginning together? And how was it? Did your background, you mentioned that you're a native prairie, native Iwan from the prairie. Did that kind of the background, your countryside background, prepare you for the new territories and rural life there, or was it so completely different that?
It helped it tremendously. Ruby is the farmer's daughter. Grew up on a farm. I mean, she basically grew up working out in the fields and on a factory around hogs and feeding animals and nothing like, and none of that has ever been a problem for her. So when we ended up in Hong Kong, we then moved out to the New Territories into a village right on the Chinese border, way out. And I remember some of our American friends and Chinese friends in Hong Kong were always very worried about, gosh, how can people live out there? I mean, it's, you know, country in there. I remember American friend came and was spooked out when a giant hog, a pig, just walked right past our house in the village. And you know, I didn't even blink, of course, because we grew up on Ruby in a farm and me in a little town. Of course, I know about pigs and hogs, big deal. And it being in a Cantonese village, the physical aspects of it and the lifestyle was no problem. Of course, the fact is that we had to learn a new language and we had to learn a new culture. That was the real stress point, but not the living conditions. But we had many friends, both Chinese and American, who later confessed to us that they thought we were totally crazy. How can anybody possibly live out there? And we didn't even occur to us that that was a problem. Ruby and I both had studied, I had studied Mandarin for a number of years. And I was getting to the point on the edge of reasonable fluency when we showed up in Hong Kong in 1969, summer, hot as hell. And I remember walking around trying to talk to people, trying to speak Mandarin. And I should have been speaking Swahili or Urdu, and I might have done better communicating with people on the street. It was crazy. Mandarin was just absolutely nothing was there, and nobody knew a word in Mandarin. I couldn't figure out even what I was trying to say. So of course we went enrolled in Chinese University had a summer school, a crash Cantonese system, a course that we enrolled in with a number of other students, all of whom happened to be Christian missionaries except us. And so some of the texts were a little odd for others.
Biblical.
That's how we basically began learning Cantonese just there. And then that was standard cityfied Cantonese, kind of spoken in Guangzhou and elsewhere. And we went out to the New Territories, and I started talking to people, and they had no more idea than a rabbit what I was saying, because they spoke Waitawa, meaning country talk. Walled village head speech. And it was essentially the country dialect that we had to learn. Then later, 7 years later, when we finished work in that village, we moved to another village where Ruby did her PhD. And that village had yet another dialect. So our life has been one struggle with Chinese, from one version to the other. It was always a struggle, but it was always just intriguing, the different dialect differences. And then there was a difference between men and women. Men had, quote, big ears, meaning that they could understand a little bit of dialectical differences because they'd have been exposed by the work and by traveling. Women, on the other hand, had little tiny ears like this because they never really left their communities, and they could not understand anybody who'd come in from outside. And even their grandchildren had trouble sometimes communicating with their grandmothers.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And
so
Ruby
when they came back,
it
was
and then Ruby speaks old women country Cantonese, the kind that when she picks up a telephone and speaks in Cantonese, I've seen some of our friends look at the phone like this. What in hell? Who, is this my great grandmother here? That's the only language that she ever heard, because she worked with women, older women, and every day with the older women. I worked in, and they were out around the different versions. And so it's a different thing. So I've always been fascinated by dialect and language.
I just wondered, was that the biggest challenge for you and Ruby, I guess, entering the field, building relationships, and, you know, forging ahead with the field work, or were there other more subtle challenges that came with that, you know, that linguistic disconnect, or, you know, or, you
The
know,
linguistic thing was always there, but one thing that is sometimes difficult for outsiders to understand, I've never tried this before, is that to make the effort to learn another language, which means you learn another culture and pay respect to that culture by wanting to get it right, it doesn't take very long for most people of goodwill to begin to understand what you're doing and to be helpful. At least a lot of them will. Some never will change. They're always, they're always suspicious of the outsider. They may have had personal experiences with so-called guilo, foreign devils, in Cantonese that would explain that. But in general, we have some very close friends who from these villages who are still life friends. I just heard from one of my friends in the village that Ruby studied, and his family for Christmas. We exchanged Christmas greetings, and even though he doesn't understand what this Christmas stuff is, but we do, and keep touch with him and others. And we have lots of friends. So we went back, unlike many anthropologists, we didn't go anywhere else. I mean, I have friends who worked, they're like on a pogo stick, bouncing around the planet, going here, going there. And we just basically, when we had time, we got on a plane and headed back to Hong Kong. For years, decades, we did that. I don't know how many total months of our life have been spent there, but I never tried to record it. But we did our first two long field trips, both PhD, mine first and then Ruby's. Ruby's at the LSE, mine at Berkeley. And then we kept going back for restudies almost every year for 2 decades or more, until fairly recently. We haven't been back for a while, partly because we're not getting any younger. The trips are harder on us. And we were beginning to have reactions to the flus and various things that we pick up there, because we had been exposed to so many things for so many decades that one of my doctors at Harvard warned me about our immune systems had been in stress city for decades.
Wow.
For everything we picked up there. So it began to be difficult in health terms. That was the most upsetting part. But then we continue online in various other ways and connect with people. Fortunately, the children of some of our old friends, and now the grandchildren of some of our old friends, of course, are with it in terms of email. And so I can connect them, and they can call up their grandfather and say, well, he's he wants to know this. So I can still do that sort of thing, which is wonderful.
That's fantastic.
I just got some questions for my this conference paper for the pigs for the ancestors. I clarified something very important through that mechanism.
That's brilliant.
That I would have gotten wrong in the paper. It's very upsetting. I'm glad I did it.
Oh, wow. There you go. IT. That's fantastic. So, I mean, when you've gone back to restudy and when you've kept in contact with these families and with the younger generations, I mean, there must have been quite seismic changes in these communities over the last few decades. I can't imagine life. I mean, it must have been a very fast change, I guess, especially around reunification, handover, and before and after. But do you think that people going to Santin and other villages in the new territories, would they encounter some of the same issues you did, or do you think there'll be different issues as a result of new types of affluence or whatever?
It's a totally new planet, absolutely, completely. The village of Santin that we began studying in, it was an immigrant community. that sent most of its men to Europe, to England, Manchester, London, Amsterdam, Dusseldorf, and Toronto, and places like that, which I followed up when I started teaching at SOAS and other times. And it became a worldwide diaspora, focused on this one lineage line, descendant from this one ancestor. And what's happened is that the social system of the town, the village, is almost totally transformed to the point where it doesn't exist. It exists abroad in the minds of the diasporics. So in many respects, it's like what's happened to some overseas Chinese communities and some overseas Indian communities that I know. In London, some of my friends in London had that kind of connection to places in India that he'd never visited. Oh, but it's my old hometown. The Chinese use the term lao jia, old house, old home, or something like that. So everything has totally changed in that respect, and more affluence. There are members of this lineage that I studied, the Mon lineage, that now have PhDs, one of whom got a PhD from SOAS, and various other things. And so they're all over the planet in all kinds of ways. And they have an international clan association that I'm connected to online if I want. So yeah, it's the kind of research that one does today is totally bizarrely different from don't forget, it's been over half a century since Ruby and I started our first work. We were just kids, and we aren't anymore. But that's how things happen. And we're keeping at it, and I'm still writing. I'm still doing projects, and I have a lot an embarrassing amount of unfinished work to do after all these decades working in these places. I don't know if I'll ever finish it.
You've opened up
is a major part of it, though, food study.
And so when you turn to food, working with these families and these communities, it sounds like you have questions that just, there are always going to be new questions that arise around food studies and understanding food and social structure through food. But I was curious to see, when you sort of turn to urban communities, I guess, with your work on McDonald's and things like this. Was that a change in perspective, or was that just what happened there?
It was an outgrowth. I would have never, ever done McDonald's, never even thought about McDonald's, except to eat there occasionally. Except that one year in the 1980s, Ruby and I went back, of course, back to our villages. In this case, we went back to, I think it was her village. And we always would go back to the families that we knew, this one family in particular in Ruby's village. And we would say, okay, we would take them out to lunch. And Ruby and I we would look forward to it for weeks. Oh boy, we're going to go to one of those places in Yunlong town that has, a dim sum and various other goodies that we hadn't had for a long time. And so we were all ready to go. And we'd pull in and we'd say, okay, let's bring the family. And we'd load into a couple of taxis. And I would say, okay, let's go to some such and such a dim sum place. And our friend would say, well, this year, the kids, and there were these little kids, and I don't know how old they were just, in grade school, 2 little boys, bouncing like balls, just getting ready to go. And our friend said, well, he said in Cantonese, our friends want to go to this new place in Yunlong. And I thought, okay, let's go to the new place. So I told the taxi driver, whatever he says, that's where we're going. And so our friend gave me instructions, and we took off, and we pulled up Main Street, Yunlong town, which is an old market town. We got out, and I looked up, and it was the biggest McDonald's I'd ever seen in my life. I mean, I swear to God, it was like 4 stories high. It was just a magnificent, crazy place. And I thought, oh, I'm looking forward. And Ruby says to me in English, I still remember distinctly, she got next to my ear and said, just shut the hell up and eat. So, so I said, so I just, grit my teeth, and we walked in, and it was a world that could never imagine. The kids were crazy for this place. And the older people didn't have any idea what they were doing. They were taking the Big Macs, and I think I've written about this, and they were disassembling it, taking it apart and looking at it, eating it piece by piece. Didn't know what it was. And the kids were just loving it because they were with it. They were part of the world culture that they'd seen on television. So that's how it happened. I decided I have to study this. I got to do it. That McDonald's project was the hardest thing I've ever done. I just resisted it. I worked on it. I fought it. I tried to figure out what the angle it was. It took me months and months to false starts to try to figure out how in God's name does an anthropologist deal with something like McDonald's. And I think that it came off reasonably well, but very much because of my friends and colleagues who participated, including my friend and former student Yan Yunchang, the UCLA professor now, who did a study at Beijing, and he studied kids going to McDonald's in Beijing, and it did a wonderful job.
Yeah, wonderful.
And others who I recruited for this project. And we all just decided, well, how does an anthropologist, God almighty, how does an anthropologist study something like McDonald's? And we struggled with it. And my introduction was the hardest thing I've ever written for that book. But I'm glad it's done. I'm just really glad it's done. But it was a struggle.
It's fantastic.
But it's done very well. The book took off, had a life of its own. I couldn't believe it, how it took off. I thought, okay, nobody's going to do this. I'll do it. But it had a life of its own.
It's a fantastic book. I mean, I think, I want to ask you actually, but I obviously have my own opinions about this, but the place of food then in Chinese studies, the book being one key aspect of how that's opened up food studies in Chinese studies or East Asian studies in total. What do you think of it now compared to earlier? You mentioned, of course, that Pittsburgh, your experience in Pittsburgh, trying to put together a food and anthropology course, met with a lot of confusion. But now, how do you find the reception of food studies within East Asian studies or China?
It's a boom field, and I mean, I watched it take off, and I remember almost standing back and thinking, good grief, how could this happen? There are journals, there are conferences every year, there are gangs of people working on all sorts of stuff. I can't keep up with it. I try, but it is really just quite amazing. And I think it has to do with the transformations of world culture and the spreading of culture and the interactions that didn't exist when I started anthropology. It would have been really quite impossible to do a lot of these studies. And now there's a huge audience for it. My friend and your colleague, Jacob, and I have, Jacob Klein, organized a book recently that Jacob took the lead on. And so there's a series of books, collections of essays that we worked on. Melissa Caldwell, a former student at Harvard, and I did also another book. And those two people, Jacob and Melissa, have really become leaders in the field, and they've taken the field in directions that I really couldn't even imagine. And I'm so, frankly, I have to admit, it's embarrassing to say, I'm so proud of both of them for doing all that. So the field has become established in its own right. It's not just a subsidiary of the way it was when I started. and almost you had to be very apologetic about doing food because it was considered trite by most anthropologists, including my former colleagues at SOAS, who who I have the deepest respect for, but they really weren't really very interested in food. I had to drag a couple of them along on couple of these projects. But what I learned at SOAS basically directed the rest of my career and life and projects. And also what I learned from Ruby via the LSE. In other words, Ruby was a graduate student at the LSE, and I was a starving, underpaid lecturer at SOAS, struggling to try to figure out how to teach in England. And I actually learned British social anthropology by following Ruby's course and seeing the stuff that she read, and she basically taught me the field of British social anthropology, which I have would never have been able to do the things that I did without that kind of connection, combining the American interest in culture, peasant studies, with the British interest in social structures, unpacking societies. And SOAS and the LSE, the two of them together, and UCL, the three places had an intercollegiate seminar when I taught there from 1973 to 1982. No, wait, 70, I think it was 70. Started teaching in 1973 and ended in 1983 or something. So it was about 10 or 11 years.
Wow.
I taught at SOAS. And those years were completely instrumental, completely foundational for my work. There was another factor involved in British anthropology in that decade, that we were all interested in social history. We all had friends and contacts at Oxford and Cambridge and London in the history departments, people doing social history of Britain and France and Europe in general, European history. And they were interested in social structure and problems of poverty, and issues of rebellion and revolution. And we were reading them and hearing them, working with them. Another very important connection was Jack Goody at, basically I remember got to know him reasonably well, and some of the work that he did, not just on food studies, but on all kinds of things. So those were the heyday. That was the big, that was so critical and important to have ended up in London at that point.
So then,
after I had taught at a couple of American universities, and then ended up in London. One of the primal experiences that taught me that I had to pay much more attention to food was almost the first month, or a few weeks of my research in the Santine village in 1969, when my patron and neighbor, also the guy who was the landlord who rented this little beat up house that we lived in, and came and invited me to a banquet. I thought, oh my gosh, that's great. Banquet, okay. And I got all ready, everything. And then we went off and we went to the ancestral hall and we stood in line until there were 8 people. We walked in, we were presented with a big pot of food. There were no tables. So we went over to a corner, put it down on the floor. We were given chopsticks and they all started, and I followed, digging in with the chopsticks, no bowls or anything separate, just you eat right out of the pot. And this was known as Punchoi in Cantonese, which means common pot dining. And I've subsequently written a lot about it because I was smitten and mesmerized by this ritual and by this meal. And the food was bizarre in the sense that it was poverty food, survival food, reminiscent of what their lives were like when they first settled in that part of China, which was, the frontier outpost. and they were eating weird things that I later investigated and tracked to the question of early settlement. What foods did they have available? This was not high cuisine. This was purposely designed low cuisine that they maintained, including fatback pork, slabs of fatback. I don't know if you've ever seen pork, the fat, slabs of British, but also of Chinese pork. It's a slab of pork on the top of their backs that's about that thick, and it's pure fat. And that is a delicacy for older people for the obvious reason they don't have any teeth. And that's another thing I began to notice. Wait a minute, these old people beyond about age 55 don't have any teeth. How do they eat? And I started tracking that. That's a project I have to write up someday.
Fantastic.
How do they eat? They eat this kind of stuff, survival food. And so they were offering big hunks of fatback, fat, white fat to people. And I got one, and people watched me a little bit. I ate it. It was awful, but I figured, okay, that's what you do. And so I have been very much interested in the question of fat ever since, and the question of teeth. How do people survive without teeth? Because most Chinese farmers, peasants, ordinary people lost their teeth by the time they were 50, 55 at the latest. And they couldn't chew. They had to eat something. And so I began to be interested in this whole project. But from that experience, squatting in the ancestral hall with my friends, and it was interesting. There was my friend who was reasonably affluent, and then sitting next to him were two very poor men who made a living by running water buffaloes for farmers. And next to them was a multimillionaire returnee immigrant who owned restaurants in London. And then various other people. And we were all equal in the eyes of the ancestors. And we were all sitting there squatting together, eating. Amazing. I remember this millionaire was just happy and was talking to these old guys that he knew from the time he was probably a kid.
It's cool, yeah.
And but it was talk about leveling. Just a premier leveling ritual that I'd ever seen. All squatting on the floor, all eating. And by the way, there were no separate bowls. You just had chopsticks. You just dug in and ate out of it.
That's fantastic. I mean, your writing on it is also so evocative. It's so excellent.
Yeah, but it was seared into my consciousness. Even today, if I close my eyes, I can remember what it was like, what it tasted like, what people were doing. It was so electrifying that I knew I had to do this.
Amazing.
And I've been following it ever since. Just yesterday, a friend of mine from Hong Kong sent me links to the South China Morning Post for fancy new upmarket versions of this Punchoi. And the Punchoi has become a symbol of Hong Kongness in counter-distinction to what's happening in China. It's a kind of sub-rosa resistance form. It's just fascinating how these food systems can transform themselves over, it's been half a century. But it's still going. That's what is so fascinating to me.
Fantastic. I love when you sent me that link. I mean, the pictures were incredible. Yeah. how opulent these basin meals are. Absolutely.
If you look at what it was, oh boy.
So then, looking out from here to the future, it sounds like you've got a lot of exciting projects on the horizon yourself. A lot of to write up from your experiences from before as well. What kinds of things really excite you now? Then, looking to the next couple of decades of Chinese food studies.
Well, I think if I were starting now, the most critical and interesting thing that probably young people are going to be looking for and at is the increasing standardization of culture in China, the erosion of dialect differences, which correlate to cultural differences. And it's really quite striking that you can begin to see that now in China, just on the news and just on what I've been following. So I think that's probably going to be a big issue. That it used to be that you could travel around China and within one day you could go through 3 dialect regions. Now all the young people speak standard Chinese, and that was happening in my visits to China in the last decades that I did it. I began to use Mandarin more and more everywhere in China, and I could always find some usually younger person who I could speak to, no matter what the dialect was. Now I suspect increasingly people will find it'll be harder and harder to find older people who can speak the so-called dialects. Cantonese is being transformed and becoming standardized. And when we would go back to our villages, some of the grandchildren could not really speak to their grandmothers and used to use Ruby as an intermediary at times, because she could speak to the old women. But the grandkids couldn't. And so I thought that this is really going to be happening all over China. So there are interesting features in that regard. And clearly food studies is in the forefront of all of this. How do you still have the super duper hot Sichuan style meals, or is that beginning to be transformed? I don't know. So I think food is perhaps one way of looking at of getting into these questions. I've now decided that I'm an historical ethnographer. I deal with I still have lots of field notes, lots of issues that I haven't dealt with that I need to go back over and get done while I can do it. One of the projects I want to do soon is elderhood. Older people, since I guess I've joined that crowd, and how their lives have changed and what it was like when I encountered them. Because I was basically just a kid when I did my first research, and my primary contacts in the village, I would say my consultants, best term for it, were all elders, men, mostly older men in their 60s and 70s, and very, very, very few people lived beyond about 75 or 76. They were gone. And I'm interested in the life of the elderhood was a recognized life course transformation. It was actually a rebirth at age 61. 61 lunar years, you start a new life essentially. At that point, you become an elder. And so I'm interested in looking at how the transition to elderhood has changed over Chinese society over the decades that I've watched it. And it happens in these villages. Some of my friends who are now as old as I am, older even, don't have the kind of life that their great grandfathers and fathers and mothers had. And it wasn't just men, it was also women. Women had a totally different culture that Ruby studied. Ruby would get up in the morning and be swept up with a bunch of women and take off. And I wouldn't see her until we'd come back to our house at night, and she would tell me what women's lives were like. And she might as well have been talking about Mars, as far as I could see. It was like she was studying Sweden and I was studying Southern Italy. Actually almost farther apart. The women had a totally different life with rituals and with lives and subculture. Men had no idea what was going on. They'd never heard it, or had no interest. And so Ruby is now still has to write up a lot of that stuff.
Amazing.
So those are things that we're trying to deal with.
Wow, I cannot wait. It's going to be fabulous.
Well, we have to find the time to do it.
Well, Woody, this has been so brilliant. Thank you so much for your time in and being able to share your recollections and your reflections about your research career, I guess, in food studies and in China studies. Thank you. It's been wonderful.